In this presentation, I'll be looking at some key quotations from Jekyll and Hyde, and in particular considering the way in which you can enhance your essays and your analysis by grouping certain quotations together, and by grouping them you give yourself options to answer a number of different questions. If we consider Utterson in chapter 1, he's a man who was austere with himself. He was long, lean, dusty and dreary, and his friendships, like ivy, were the growth of time. Here he is a man who is presented as the archetype of the Victorian gentleman. He utterly embodies and upholds the Victorian moral code. In the quotation long, lean, dusty, dreary, if we're considering writer's method here, then the use of alliteration in long and lean, and the use of assonance in long, lean, dusty, dreary, creates this idea. It drags out the sounds of the words to create this man who is boring in many ways, but who is consistent, who is enduring. But also in the description of him as his friendships being like ivy, ivy likewise is enduring, but it is also invasive, it takes over. And so we get the first sense of this idea of duality within Utterson. He's perhaps not all he seems to be in the opening of the novel. And that is picked up in chapter 2. In Utterson's dream, he dreams about the figure of Hyde. The figure in these two phases haunted the lawyer all night. And it's worth considering Utterson's dream in some detail, particularly the way in which Hyde is presented. But this quotation becomes particularly significant when we then consider the quotation later in this chapter, when Utterson the lawyer began to haunt the door. And by using the verb haunt for both of those characters, we can see Stevenson drawing parallels between Utterson and Hyde. There is the early suggestion that there is not as much to separate these two characters as you might think. Then we can think about some quotations again for Edward Hyde and couple these together. In chapter 1 in Enfield's story, he is described like some damned juggernaut. By the time we get to Utterson's dream in chapter 2, Hyde has become that human juggernaut. Both of these quotations in isolation offer the opportunity for some depth of analysis, but together they become particularly powerful. By describing him as a juggernaut, first with the simile in chapter 1, then with the metaphor in chapter 2, a juggernaut is an unstoppable mythical force. So we get the potential of Hyde to be unstoppable, to be relentless, and therefore for the dark side that Hyde represents to be unstoppable and to be relentless. But also it is a way of Victorian society dismissing what Hyde represents. If they can present him as monstrous or mythical in some way, they don't have to accept what Hyde represents, which is the dark side of human nature. They don't have to accept that in themselves. But by coupling these two quotations together, we start to see just the first sign of acceptance within Utterson, and it's a subconscious acceptance because it comes within a dream, that Hyde is in fact human. In chapter 1 he is utterly mythical, utterly monstrous. By chapter 2 he's become that human juggernaut. We get the first sign that Utterson is accepting the potential for Hyde to be human. And if members of Victorian society in this novel accept that Hyde is human, they have to accept the potential for Hyde to exist within themselves. And so in independence, these are two powerful quotations. Together, they become revealing, not just about Hyde, not just about the dark side, but about Utterson as well. And you can start to see how you can use these quotations to analyse the character of Hyde, to analyse the theme of duality, but also to analyse the character of Gabriel Utterson. If we consider the transformations of Jekyll into Hyde, or the suggestions of transformations of Jekyll into Hyde, we'll look at chapter 3 and chapter 7. In chapter 3, Utterson goes to visit his friend Jekyll and he mentions Hyde. And upon that first mention, we are told that Jekyll grew pale to the very lips and there came a blackness about his eyes. This is the first sign of a transformation of Jekyll into Hyde. We start to see perhaps Hyde emerging in Jekyll for the first time, but it's a very soft, very subtle transformation. He's appearing, the verbs grew and came, there's a passive nature to those verbs. But if we then look at chapter 7, the incident at the window, when Enfield and Utterson go to see Jekyll and they speak to him as he sat in his window, we can see the transformation take on a different quality. The smile was struck from his face and replaced by a look of such abject terror and despair. The verb this time struck has movement and has violence to it. So we can see the transformation is a much more sudden one and a much more violent one. And therefore we can see that Hyde's influence over Jekyll is growing in strength, and therefore the dark side of Jekyll, the evil side of Jekyll, is starting to grow in strength as well. So again, we have two quotations which offer opportunities for analysis independently, but become much more powerful when you couple them together. Likewise, we can look at Hyde's growing influence and power in another way through his own actions. In chapter 1, he is said to have trampled calmly on the young girl. By the time we get to chapter 4, we see Hyde's brutal murder of Carew, and he broke out in a great flame of anger and clubbed him to the earth and broke out of all bounds. Once again, the verbs are growing in intensity, growing in strength, and growing in violence. So we can see Hyde's evil, Hyde's danger, Hyde's threat is growing. We also get that notion in the metaphor, the great flame of anger. Flames, of course, if left unmanaged, have the potential to grow out of control and to become destructive. Hyde and the dark side that he represents also have the potential to grow and become out of control if not managed or tended or looked after. And when it says he broke out of all bounds, we are seeing a man who is breaking free from the restraints of the Victorian moral code and Victorian civility. That incident in chapter 4 can also be coupled with the incident when Utterson and Poole break down the cabinet door. Because if we look at the verbs again here, used to describe Hyde's murder of Carew, he broke out in a great flame of anger and clubbed him to the earth, whereupon the bones were audibly shattered and the body jumped upon the pavement. Clubbed, shattered, and jumped. They offer detailed analysis in their own right, but when we look at how they compare to Utterson and Poole's actions in chapter 8, when they break down the cabinet door, the blow shook, the red baize door leaped, up went the axe again, and the panels crashed and the frame bounded. There is a matching of auditory imagery, and there is a matching of violent dynamic verbs. So Stevenson very deliberately draws a parallel between the actions of Utterson and Poole in chapter 8 with the actions of Hyde in chapter 4. The motives are very different, of course. Hyde's is a murderous motive, and Utterson and Poole is in the aid of their friend. So the motives are different. But the actions have a monstrosity that matches Hyde's monstrosity in chapter 4. So Stevenson is perhaps revealing to us that even people like Utterson and Poole have the potential for violence and the potential for darkness within themselves. It is no wonder, therefore, that once they've broken down the cabinet door, it says the besiegers are appalled by their own riot. Appalled perhaps because for the first time Utterson and Poole have been forced to recognise this darkness, this potential for darkness and savagery within themselves. And we can see this throughout the novel. And again, coupling quotations together. Sawbones, the doctor in chapter 1, is emotional as a bagpipe. As soon as he sees Hyde, he doesn't even speak to him. As soon as he sees him, he turns sick and white with a desire to kill him. He becomes immediately monstrous. Lanyon goes from a hearty, healthy, dapper, red-faced gentleman in chapter 2 to a man whose flesh had fallen away, a man who has his death warrant written upon his face, a man suffering from a deep-seated terror of the mind. Again, he has become something much darker and much more monstrous later in the novel. And then we've already looked at Utterson, goes from a man of absolute self-control in chapter 1 to a man who began to haunt the door in chapter 2. A man whose imagination was enslaved, a man who breaks down the cabinet door with violence in chapter 8 and then is appalled by his own actions. So we see the potential, if we couple these quotations together, we see the potential for darkness and evil and violence and savagery in every single member within the novel, not just in Jekyll and Hyde. So let's have a look at how we can then put this idea into a piece of writing and how your analysis can take on additional detail, and you're going to score big marks for AO1 and AO2 if you can start coupling these references together. Let's take a question here. How far is Edward Hyde presented as a dangerous character? The danger that Hyde presents to Victorian society intensifies in chapter 4 when he murders Sir Danvers Carew. You'll see I'm addressing the question directly in my opening statement. Then I'll introduce my evidence. When Hyde broke out in a great flame of anger, Stevenson's use of the metaphor confirms the potential of Hyde and the dark side that he represents to grow out of control if not managed, just like a flame. I'm identifying the method in the metaphor and analysing its significance. But I need to bring in some more evidence. Furthermore, when Hyde clubbed Carew to the ground and the bones were audibly shattered, the use of violent dynamic verbs intensifies the savage capability of Hyde, especially when compared to the way he trampled calmly on the young girl in chapter 1. Linking quotations together again not only shows my knowledge of the text, but allows me to comment on the way in which the author is constructing this novel structurally. I'll continue. The true danger of Hyde becomes apparent when Utterson and Poole break down the cabinet door in chapter 8. Through the use of verbs such as leaped, shook, crashed and bounded, Stevenson draws a direct parallel between their actions and the actions of Hyde in chapter 4. They are acting almost as monstrously as Hyde. It is no wonder, therefore, that they are appalled by their own riot, as Utterson and Poole have been forced to recognise the potential for darkness in themselves, and therein lies the greatest danger of Hyde. So because, even though I'm using quotations about Utterson and Poole here, because I'm comparing them to quotations about Hyde, I'm still answering a question about Edward Hyde. And that becomes particularly powerful because I can also apply exactly the same quotations to a question about Utterson. By the time we get to chapter 8, Utterson has transformed from a man who was never lighted by a smile, a man of ultimate self-control, to someone who displays violence in breaking down the cabinet door with Poole. Indeed, the verbs used to describe this act, shook, leaped, crashed and bounded, are reminiscent of the way Hyde clubbed Carew to the ground in chapter 4 when the body jumped upon the pavement. By drawing this direct parallel, Stevenson confirms the potential for darkness in even the most archetypal Victorian gentlemen such as Utterson. It is no wonder, therefore, that Utterson and Poole are appalled by their own riot. They have perhaps been forced to recognise the possibility that they too have a Hyde inside themselves. So you'll see the power of coupling quotations together, because I've answered two entirely different questions using the same pieces of evidence. And I would encourage you in your revision, when you're creating your flashcards and you're planning your questions, to be thinking about quotations that you can group together and that will allow you to answer a number of different questions in the exam.